Alrighty, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, the game's GM's Guide, rather I should say, and we are talking today about dice. One of the things that's come up recently is the variability that occurs in games and the capriciousness with which players sometimes respond to those dice rolls, and so we're going to get into that. Before we do, however, I want you to make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons. Let the as the saying goes, let the algorithm, let the world know that you're part of the audience and you want to know more. And we will be doing regular updates as we always do, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time, and Fridays 10 a.m. And well, let's get started, shall we? So we're going to talk a little bit about dice, and if you have played a role play game, or even if you've just watched one, there's all those shiny little dice with the different sides that are mystifying to those that aren't familiar with the game and are sometimes a burden to those that do. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of them. Now, dice have been around for thousands of years, and although they are fairly ubiquitous, most cultures have some form of randomization through solid objects, but they were first initially used because it was something that was interesting. You could see that there was a pattern not only to the shape and size of the dice, but you could also see that there was a almost prescient form of dice values. And of course, if you rolled enough dice in enough particular sequences, you would see patterns form. And thereby, people began to see that this was a way to perhaps foretell the future. If you could get the dice to be particularly lucky in one way or another, then they would provide a portent of something good that might happen. Now, the initial ones, according to historians, were knuckle bones, the very joints of different animals' feet, and even mortal knuckle bones. But the idea was that they were first attributed a numeric value to the sides based on anatomy, and then they were rolled, and you would roll a collection of them, like, say, an entire hand's worth of bones. And the person casting the dice would then determine the outcome of that die roll and its portents. Some of the earliest dice that have been discovered were found in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Rome, and the form and even the method for reading them varied from region to region. And what really kind of is interesting is even the mechanism for determining which sides were numbered. The original configuration for them, what was called the prime configuration, was that you would put the numbers in opposition by their value. So the 1 and the 2 were opposed, the 3 and the 4 were opposed, the 5 and the 6 were opposed. Later configurations changed to what we now know of as the sevens configuration, and that is the idea that you put the 1 and the 6 opposed to each other, the 2 and the 5 and the 3 and the 4, because that would create a, quote, seemingly more even distribution numerically, although categorically a six-sided mechanism is going to roll with the even distribution of all six sides anyway. During the Renaissance, they were fascinated with probability and chance, and so the concepts of the different sizes of sides, the mechanism, for example, for the standard six-sided die is almost natural in that when you are futzing with a piece of clay, you'll inevitably create cubes because of the way our fingers work and our perception of length, width, and height. But all of this, of course, is just conjecture. The reality is that the history of dice is a virtual unknown. We know that they've been around forever and that people have used them forever, but where they actually originated is still lost in history. So then the question becomes, what is the role of dice in tabletop role playing games? And fundamentally, the purpose for using a randomized value in any decision making is to afford the opportunity to be wrong in a way that doesn't challenge the person who's making the decision. The idea of having a random factor in a decision making process seems almost illogical because we want so bad to be able to control our world. And yet, if you are in a story environment where you have a director, storyteller, game master, or whatever, that person's decision can sometimes feel personal or directed or harsh, and a use of a randomized factor lifts that away from the persona and gives the opportunity for those who are participating to see that it was just luck. It wasn't purported or driven by the storyteller. It just was pure random values. Now, in some games, the randomness of it is more valued than in others, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. But the idea of dice is simply to move the decision making process in micro decisions into the realm of something beyond the control of the player, beyond control of the storyteller, so that it feels more natural. Now, the reason for that randomness to almost be a requirement has to do with the fact that a story is as was pointed out to me several weeks ago, an asymmetrical proposal. The game master's knowledge base about what's going on in the story is considerably greater and really has a major effect on how the story goes. And so by having randomness built in to your mechanism, you improve the state of the agency of the players. In other words, they feel that their part in the story is more important because the big and important decisions are pushed into a random field and thereby taken off of the table of the game master and put into a more seemingly equitable position of what happens. Now, there are game systems with no dice. I've done a little bit of research on this, and there are dozens of systems that use cards, or they use torn up pieces of paper, or tiles, dominoes, and so on. I'll put a link down below to a site that gives a list of several of them. But almost all of them still require a random factor in they do so by some means. And so therefore the other diceless systems are really merely substitutes because they want to be innovative or they want to be distanced for some reason from the perceived capriciousness of a die rolling randomness. There are a few that the decision making just simply is softened, if you will, by player input and such. And so, as I said, I'll put a link below. I don't put much stock in them personally because the systems that are diceless, most of them, as I said, are just simply replacing the dice with another mechanism. And I'd prefer to recognize and acknowledge that there is a random factor, but focus it on something that both the storyteller and the players can immediately see the perceived value of, and therefore be able to come to the same conclusion without having to have an arcane random factor interpreted through a storyteller. One of the major advantages of using a die rolling system is that agency trigger allows for the players and the game masters to both see the experience or the outcome as capricious and arbitrary, and that reduces the combatant nature with which most game masters have to contend if they make decisions without having a die roll mechanism. A second reason why the die rolling mechanism is particularly useful is that it can be replicable in many ways. In other words, if you do an action and you know which dice you're going to be using, you can replicate that same action time after time, and the players will be able to understand what the purpose of that die roll is. Whereas if you don't, and instead you use some sort of arbitrary system, then the players don't have really a leg to stand on to be able to level the playing field for themselves in the game sequence. Now this is the part in this video that is going to get me in trouble, because I'm going to reveal a secret for any of you who are storytellers. And this is actually true in a lot of different ways. An associate of mine is in the business of mentalism, and it's very evident there that this same secret applies, and that is random factors only need to be random when you need them to be random, and otherwise you can alter and control the environment in such a way that the randomness vanishes. And by that I mean when we are storytelling, when we are going through even a particularly vicious combat scene, we can arbitrarily, in order to make the story flow properly, either dismiss or require additional die rolls so that the story comes out the way we want. If you have any passing understanding of how statistics work, the die rolling really is at the behest of the game master. And if a situation is such that he needs the randomness to become zero, he can simply choose to not roll the dice. And therefore, I'm not saying that the game master is necessarily cheating on the dice rolls, but he can simply decide that one was not necessary and will generate that part of the story. And I know, I'm anticipating we'll get some feedback, so I'd love to have a conversation about this. Is a random factor mandatory in your game system, and why? I think that'd be a fun conversation to have. And what systems have you run into, and what role play mechanisms have you engaged with that either utilized a diceless system or perhaps had something other than a dice outcome determine the decision of the game? Now I want to tell kind of a funny story, and the idea here is that we're going to talk about pips. And in the term pips, I'm using it as an acronym for the polyhedral infesting poltergeists. The idea is that the pips on your dice are residences for these tiny spirits that live within them. Now, this obviously is, take it for what it's worth. These pips, therefore, can be fed and controlled and bred by the way you treat your dice. For example, if you are constantly putting your dice in a darkened bag and providing and eliminating their chance to be interacting with the sunlight, you actually may be harming them, and so the pips may not serve you well when it comes to rolling your dice. Furthermore, if you are putting them out so they can get sunlight, realize that the more often that the number gets the light that it needs, the heavier it becomes. And so therefore, in this case, therefore you would put your dice in such a way that the low numbers are always up, and you keep them in broad sunlight so that those lower numbers get heavier, so that when you roll dice, they will roll to the bottom, of course, of the dice, and therefore you'll get the higher rolls that you generally need for most roleplay games. Additionally, if you be careful when washing your dice, because you can actually wash off some of their population, and that would therefore reduce their impact. So cleaner dice tend to roll cleaner, so to speak, more evenly, and therefore dice that are kept in a dark and rather grimy place have problems because they tend to roll cold quite a bit because it takes much more to heat them up. Also, if you are holding dice and you need to arbitrarily increase their numeric value, simply breathe on the dice. The idea of blowing out across your dice adds extra body heat to them, and therefore they're going to roll warmer. Whereas if you need them to, say, roll lower for some arbitrary reason, then breathe in and bring the cool air across the dice, and therefore when they roll, they'll be a lower number. So those are just some examples of the care and feeding of the pips and your dice, and these will provide a better outcome for your die rolling experience overall. That was all humor, by the way, just in case. That was humor. Okay. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the actual dice protocols that are required when you're playing a role playing game. And it probably applies to all games in general. These dice protocols are ways to play with the dice fairly and not interfere with other people's psychological bugaboos. One primary one, for example, is that no dice roll is required unless the game master requires it. And I know of players who love to manipulate and handle their dice constantly throughout the game, and that's part and parcel to the gaming process, whatever floats your boat. But the idea of rolling the dice really should be left in terms of when to the storyteller. I know people who will roll the dice until they get a good number, and then they'll stop and leave that dice roll on the table, so that when a GM asks for the die roll, they'll give that outcome that they fundamentally front-loaded. And while to a certain extent that's a manageable opportunity, if the game master is aware of it, he can determine when to allow dice rolls that are on the table to stand. But generally, it's kind of, pardon the phrase, dirty pool to utilize a die roll that has not been called for. It really doesn't matter. Temporally, it doesn't matter, but it's just considered bad form. A second dice protocol is don't roll a bunch of dice if you only need an outcome from one of them, because how can the storyteller know ever which one was the intended die if you roll three of them? I know of a player that does that so that he already has his ideas, he already has his, quote, advantage die roll made, so that if the game master says, well, you do get advantage on that, instead of having to re-roll, he already has the second roll on the table. But that's problematic, because which one do you call first? And it can be easily defined, but it also is a little bit messy. So one of the dice protocols is that the storyteller should call for the die rolls before they are made. A second protocol that some game masters choose differently from me, but generally where you roll the dice matters, only in terms of being able to be read by other players and such like. So you should, if you've got a dice rolling tray or whatever, any dice that fall out of that need to be re-rolled. In certain cases, perhaps if it's a percentage dice roll, if one of them falls out, you re-roll both dice. That all needs to be just determined by you and your games group in advance. Some players say let it roll where it lies, so if a dice goes on the floor, you read it on the floor. That's totally up to you. In our group, we tend to roll in a container, and we tend to re-roll anything that falls out, and to only make those rolls when the game master requires them. But these are just some examples of dice protocols. Sometimes it'll be thematic, so you'll say bring your dark colored dice, or perhaps maybe it's themed to the character's class, so that you roll red dice if you're a warrior or whatever. All of those protocols can be orchestrated between the players in advance of their game session, so they're all on the same page. Alrighty, so parting shots. We're going to talk a little bit about some dice lore. Like, for example, there is some discussion about which set of dice are the most unique. And I recall that some years back at the Origins Games Convention, of which I was a part at the time, we actually coordinated the sale of a set of dice made from mammoth bones. That they were built or created by Crystal Cast, and they auctioned them off, and I believe they got almost $10,000 for them. It was ridiculous. Other examples of dice lore is there are dice sizes and shapes that you may not be aware of. For example, a company called Game Science specifically mills their dice rather than using an extrusion process to make them, and therefore they are milled in such a way that you can stack them side to side taller than any other dice, simply because their sides are milled to perfection in terms of their shape. I don't know if that's still the case, but that was one of their big selling points. Game Science also had for a while dice that had been actually engineered by a rocket scientist. The company's owner was Luzaki, and Colonel Luzaki was an Air Force engineer, and he actually created 24-sided dice and 14-sided dice, and I believe he may have actually made the original 10-sided dice that now have become the most common percentage dice alternatives, which is to roll two 10-sided dice, each one graduated for their position in the naming of the dice. Other pieces of dice lore is that the concept of using a d20 is mathematically important, because it is considered each side is roughly 5% of the total, and therefore at 5% mathematically that's considered to be, actually statistically is considered to be of statistical significance. So having a value change of 5% per side is essential to the die roll feeling important and valuable, and why we really revel at the natural 20 or we rail at the natural 1. It's just mechanically interesting to have statistical significance on each facing. So the original percentile systems were actually, the original dice collections were actually made on the basis of what are considered to be platonic solids. And so that would be the icosahedron, like this, a d20, all the way down to the tetrahedron, which is a 4-sided. And so each of those shapes was considered to be mathematically pure, so to speak, and so that's why the dice that with those various sides became popular for game use. Alrighty, well, that's all I really have to say about dice at this point. I want to thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of our community. Make sure you check out our Patreon account, patreon.com/Nikos, if you want to become part of our community. And of course, I'd like to hear your comments about dice. What are your favorite type of dice? And of course, you can include images and stuff if you want to, so because that way we can all kind of see what you're looking at. I also wanted to let you know that we have live games for our Patreon supporters on the weekends, Fridays and Sundays, and so by becoming a part of our community, you get a chance to play with us on a regular basis. I'm Jonathan Albin, the Game Master's Guide, and I'll see you next time.